that morning, this young man who had spent most of his life volunteering at youth group and then teaching youth group at his church, serving others. Brandon was not promised the next day. And Brandon did not get the next day. But what Brandon did on the last day of his life was Brandon gave his life for his brother. Brandon laid his life down for his brother. And I just remember thinking, God, I don't know if I'm going to wake up tomorrow. How did I live my life today? How did I live my life today? Did I live my life for you? Or did I live my life for myself? And I realized that every single day that we lift our heads off our pillows is one more chance, one more opportunity, one more day to serve the very God that gave us breath. To serve that God, to love that God, and to love our neighbor as ourselves. And that's the lesson I got from Brandon. He gave his life literally for his brother. But he would have given his life for any child. Because that's the kind of man that Brandon was. And I hope that I could live my life with just 1 ounce of that courage that Brandon had. Just 1 ounce of that courage to be willing to live my life for someone else. And that's really what we're doing here. That's really what the pro-life movement is about. It's about loving our brother, our neighbor, as ourselves. It's about the fact that every single child inside that womb is an equal brother or sister to us, is an equal human person with value, with dignity, created by God, that has a right to live and needs a generation to stand up and say no more to their death and demise. That's what this is about. We must bring the truth of what is happening to this generation to the forefront of the media, to this nation. Because this nation doesn't really believe 100%. There's still that little separation. Even in so many churches, they don't really believe 100% that the child in the womb is just as equal as every one of us in this room. And I found that out the hard way this year. This was one of the roughest years of my whole life. It's one of the most beautiful years of my whole life, as I have found what I am searching for. I've been searching for so many years in joining the Catholic Church. But it's also been one of the roughest years of my life. On February 23rd, I saw how much the church really believed whether a child in the womb was truly a child in the womb. On February 23rd of this year, I was laying in my bed in Ohio, just about to call up for my kids to come up and wrestle. My kids love to come up in the morning. That's my big time that I like to spend with the kids, is in the morning. At night, they're going to karate, they're doing all that stuff. So I spend time in the morning wrestling and playing with the kids, doing Tickle Monster and all of that. And I'm waking up and I'm just kind of barely awake, and all of a sudden I hear a blood-curdling scream. And my wife is screaming, "Bryan!" And I rush out of bed, and I realize it's coming from the bathroom. And I run into the bathroom, and my wife is standing next to the toilet, bleeding. And I look down in the toilet, and she had just lost our 3-month-old child. My son was floating in the toilet. And I looked down and I looked at her, and she's bleeding really bad, and I wrapped a towel around her, and we've got some pants on her, and I picked my son up and I put him in a container, and we rush her into the van, and I'm driving like crazy to the hospital, and I'm calling people, I think like Cheryl and a couple other people, and I'm just like, please pray for my wife, she's bleeding to death, and I don't know what to do. And I rushed her into that emergency room, and the emergency room doctor couldn't do anything. And he called for the OBGYN who ran in the room. And as I'm standing next to my wife, my son's laying there, the OBGYN runs in the room and he looks up at the thing, and the first words out of his mouth is, "Oh my God, is that her blood pressure?" And at that very moment, I'm thinking, oh my God, my wife is dying. I cannot live, I cannot breathe without this woman. And he was able to stop the bleeding. And I'm praying, and I'm just thanking God for this man who's able to save her life. And she had to stay in the hospital that night. She lost over 2 pints of blood. And I called the pastor of the church I was going to, and he came down and he starts talking to me, and I started asking him questions. I said, we need to organize a funeral for my son. He's like, wow, we've never really thought of that. I have no idea what to do. And I waited for like 2 days, and I didn't hear anything from the church. And so I started calling the funeral home myself, and I called the cemetery and found out that almost every cemetery in the country has a plot for situations like that. And most funeral homes will do the services for free. And so I tell them, and we got it set up, and that was a Thursday, and we set it up for the following Tuesday. And that Sunday, my wife was still on ordered bed rest at home, and I took 4 of the children to church. And I'm sitting there at church, and we had actually taken the baby home on Thursday, and we all sat around and said goodbye. And I asked my children, what do you think he is? What's his name? And they picked the name Benjamin. And we named him Benjamin Davis Kemper. And we took him to the funeral home to be prepared and got his little casket. And so Sunday I show up at church with 4 of the kids, and we're sitting in the back. We really didn't want to interact that much. We're pretty sad. And the pastor starts to announce my son's funeral. And he starts to say, and this Tuesday, the Kempers will have a funeral for Benjamin Davis. And then he pauses. And what came out of his mouth next just blew my mind. The pastor started giving a disclaimer for my son's funeral. He goes, you know what, hold on. I understand there are women here that have had a miscarriage before, and you've chosen not to have a funeral. That's perfectly fine. This is just something they chose to do. He just referred to the burial and funeral of my son as just something they chose to do. And I almost walked out. I was in shock, and I looked, and half the church is turning looking at me in shock. And he goes on to say, it's no big deal. It's just, and so I'm thinking, oh my gosh. And we left that day, and I'm just devastated. And then Tuesday comes along, and my pastor and his wife, and one couple from my church of almost 200 people showed up at my son's funeral. 2 families. More people from my children's karate class came to my son's funeral than my own church. And they know what I do for a living. Every year in January after the March for Life, I come back and I teach a Sunday school on pro-life and talk about what's going on. They have financially supported Stand True. They have financially supported the summer mission trip that we do. They have done so much, but even them, not a single elder, not a single deacon from my church showed up at my son's funeral. And when I called them and I confronted them, the pastor and the elders, these words were spoken from their mouth. I asked them, I said, listen, if that had been Kimberly, my oldest daughter, if that had been one of your children or any of the other 50 children that run around our church every Sunday, would you have been at their funeral? And they said, yes, but it's not any other funeral. It's just a miscarriage. We haven't seen it. We have not made that connection that child that is in the womb is literally 100% the same as you and I. And that is what has to change. We have to show this world that those are equal people of equal value. But it's happened so many times in history. The Dred Scott decision in 1857, where our own Supreme Court of the United States of America upheld the idea that black people were only 3/5 of a human. And therefore they could be traded, sold, beaten, killed, and it didn't matter because they weren't really human beings. They weren't fully human beings like you and I. Lila mentioned the Holocaust. A few years ago, my best friend Jeremy and I were speaking at a conference in Scotland. And we decided after that to take a plane over to Poland, to Krakow, Poland, because we wanted to walk through Auschwitz and Birkenau and see a concentration camp firsthand. We had seen the films. You know, we had seen the stories in school. We'd been to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. Pat and I have been there several times. But I wanted to understand it completely. And when you walk into Auschwitz, there's this wrought iron sign. And in German, it says the words, "Work makes free." Work makes free. It said that because they were playing mind games with the Jews. All the way through, they were playing mind games with the Jews. They were telling them, if you work really hard when you get there, you're going to get your clothing back, and you're going to get your wife and your children back, and you're going to get a job, and you're going to get a home, you're going to get everything back. If you just work really hard, you're going to get your freedom. And as we walked into that concentration camp, we went into several buildings. The first building was one of the most powerful buildings as far as what I saw there. I'm in that building, and the first thing I saw was this giant pile of hair, human hair. And as you're looking at the human hair, you look behind you, and there's a jacket and a blanket that if you looked very closely at the edges, they were woven out of human hair. The Nazis would shave the hair off the Jews to make blankets and jackets to keep themselves warm. And then there was this pile of prosthetic legs and arms. And as I'm looking at that, I'm thinking to myself, oh my gosh, these are literally pieces of people. But then I came upon a glass case. And inside of this glass case was baby clothes. And those baby clothes had a pair of hand-knit wool shorts. And I lost it. You see, at that point, my youngest child was Atticus, our 5th child. And every night, my wife uses cloth diapers. And when you use cloth diapers at night, over the top of the cloth diaper, you put on a little pair of hand-knit wool shorts. So I'm looking at these little hand-knit wool shorts, and they look just like the ones I put on my son Atticus every night. And I walked out of that place. Jeremy and I walked out, and we're looking at each other. We couldn't even speak. And then we walked into a bus, and they took us to the next place. Another camp called Birkenau. When you walk into Birkenau, there's a set of train tracks going right through the center of the gate. And over to the right is a barracks, and it has this long cement bench, like from here to the 6th row. And it had holes cut through the cement bench. That was the toilet. There was no curtains, no separators, no walls. Men and women, children, everybody using the same toilet in front of each other. You were only allowed to use the toilet twice a day. Once in the morning and once at night. So the most sought after job in that camp, the job that people would strive for the most, is the person that got to stay back, crawl inside of that, and clean the excrement out with their own hands and bare hands. Because that meant that they didn't have to work outside, and that they were able to use the toilet more than twice a day. Can you imagine if you had to go to college and the best career that you can get was to clean toilets with your bare hands? That's the life the Jews had. So we left that building, and we started walking down these train tracks. And you got to this rock bed where they would unload the train. Now, they had been in this train for 8, 9 days, standing like this with every possession they had. And the only way they ate or drank food or water is if they had it in their possessions. They would stand like that. They would go to the bathroom in their pants. There's no laying down. They'd sleep standing up. And people were dying as they're leaning up against them. So they're in there for 8 or 9 days. They come off the train, and the German soldiers would walk up and they'd start to separate you. And they'd look at this group right over here, and they'd look at this group, and you guys look healthy. So this row right here, you guys are the healthy ones. You're going to go to the barracks, and you're going to get assigned a job. Everybody over here. But this row, you have a girl in a wheelchair here. You have some elderly people. You guys, you know what? You really need a hot shower and some fresh, clean clothes. So you got the elderly, the young, the handicapped, everybody over here. We're going to take you down the thing. And so they'd send you off to the barracks to get your work assignment. And then they walk with you, and I walked the path that they walked. And they would take you to the building at the end of the train tracks, and they'd tell you to take off all your clothes and put it on a number and remember your number so you can get your fresh, clean clothes. And you would walk into the shower room, and the doors would close, and you would look up waiting for that hot water because you've been in there for 8 days. You're full of excrement. You're just standing there. And all of a sudden, 2 holes open in the ceiling, 2 cans drop through, and within 20 minutes, every one of you have just been gassed to death. They played that mind game with you all the way until the moment of your death. But then they came over to you guys. And they said, we have your job for you now. And they would walk you to the back of that building. And they would open the door, and there laying on the floor is your grandmother, dead. And they would tell you to pick up her body. And if you hesitated, they would shoot you in the head on the spot. And I'm standing there looking at this building going, oh,